The wealthy white woman stood in the aisle of first class, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her diamond rings caught the cabin lights as she pointed at passengers throughout the plane. "I will not let this plane take off until every single black person is removed," she shrieked. At that exact moment, the cockpit door swung open. A tall figure in a crisp pilot uniform stepped out. What happened next left every passenger on that Boeing 777 absolutely speechless. But what happened next would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone on that plane. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city and country in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Now, let's get into what really happened on Atlantic Airways Flight 847. Captain Jerome Washington stood in the cockpit of the Boeing 777, running through his pre-flight checklist with the precision that had defined his entire career. At 52 years old, he carried himself with an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. His salt and pepper hair was cropped short in a military style that he had never abandoned, even after leaving the United States Air Force more than 15 years ago. His brown eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences most people could never imagine, yet they also radiated a warmth that put everyone around him at ease. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches, Jerome had the kind of presence that filled a room the moment he entered it. His pilot uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection without a single wrinkle, and the 4 gold stripes on his shoulder epaulets gleamed under the cockpit lights, announcing his rank as captain to anyone who understood what they meant. Jerome's journey to this cockpit had been anything but ordinary. He had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of South Side Chicago, where opportunities were scarce and expectations for young black men were tragically low. But Jerome had dreams that stretched far beyond those city blocks. He had looked up at the sky as a child and knew that someday, somehow, he would soar among the clouds. Against all odds, he earned a scholarship to the Air Force Academy, where he graduated with honors despite facing discrimination at nearly every turn. For 20 years, he served his country as a fighter pilot, flying missions that most people only saw in movies. During Operation Desert Storm, he had completed over 150 combat missions, putting his life on the line to protect the freedom of every American citizen, regardless of their color. His bravery earned him numerous decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors a military aviator could receive. He had retired from the Air Force with the rank of lieutenant colonel, his chest heavy with medals and his heart full of pride. After his military career, Jerome had transitioned to civilian aviation, joining Atlantic Airways as a commercial pilot. 15 years later, he was one of the most experienced and respected captains in the entire company. He had logged over 25,000 flight hours, carried millions of passengers safely to their destinations, and trained countless young pilots who now flew their own routes across the globe. His wife, Dr. Evelyn Washington, was a cardiovascular surgeon at one of Atlanta's most prestigious hospitals, and together they had raised 2 sons who had both graduated from Ivy League universities. Their oldest, Jerome Jr., was a civil rights attorney in New York City, and their youngest, Malcolm, was an aerospace engineer at NASA. Jerome had built a life that his younger self could barely have imagined, and he had done it through hard work, determination, and an unwavering belief in his own worth. The flight today was Atlantic Airways Flight 847, departing from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and heading to Los Angeles International Airport. It was a late Friday afternoon in late June, the peak of summer travel season, and the Boeing 777 was nearly at capacity with 342 passengers and a crew of 12. The passenger manifest reflected the beautiful diversity of America itself, with travelers of every background, race, and ethnicity taking their seats for the 4.5-hour journey to the West Coast. Among the passengers were business executives in tailored suits, families heading to Disneyland for vacation, college students returning home for summer break, and a group that caught Jerome's attention during the pre-flight briefing, 15 high school students from Frederick Douglass High School in Atlanta who were traveling to tour UCLA and other California universities. They were accompanied by 2 teachers who had organized the educational trip. There was also a multi-generational black family, 3 generations strong, traveling to Los Angeles to attend a granddaughter's wedding. The atmosphere in the terminal had been the usual controlled chaos of summer travel, but nothing had suggested that this flight would be anything other than routine. Margaret Thornton had arrived at the gate with the imperious air of someone who believed the world existed solely for her convenience. At 58 years old, she was the widow of Richard Thornton, a real estate tycoon who had built an empire of shopping malls and luxury developments across the Southeast. When Richard had died of a heart attack 3 years ago, Margaret had inherited everything, a fortune valued at over $80 million. She wore her wealth like armor, from the perfectly coiffed blonde hair that her stylist touched up every 2 weeks to the diamonds that dripped from her ears, neck, and fingers. Her Chanel suit cost more than most people earned in a month, and her Louis Vuitton carry-on bag contained more designer items than most closets. Margaret had spent her entire adult life in the upper echelons of Atlanta society, attending charity galas and country club luncheons where everyone looked exactly like her. She sat on the boards of several exclusive organizations, all of which had unspoken but strictly enforced policies about who could and could not become members. Her late husband had shared her views, and together they had created a bubble of privilege that insulated them from anyone they considered beneath them, which included anyone who did not share their wealth, their social standing, or their skin color. Margaret settled into seat 2A in first class, immediately pressing the call button to summon a flight attendant. When Denise Parker appeared at her side, Margaret's lip curled almost imperceptibly. Denise was a 35-year-old black woman who had been a flight attendant for 12 years, known throughout the airline for her professionalism and genuine warmth with passengers. She wore her natural hair in a neat updo and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who was excellent at her job. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" Denise asked with a practiced smile. Margaret looked her up and down before answering. "Champagne. The good kind. And make it quick." As Denise went to fulfill the request, Margaret surveyed her surroundings. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed that several other passengers in first class were black, including a well-dressed businessman across the aisle and an elegant older woman reading a novel near the front. Margaret's perfectly painted lips pressed together in displeasure, but she said nothing. Yet. She accepted her champagne from Denise without a word of thanks, her gaze sliding past the flight attendant as if she were invisible. Then Margaret settled back in her seat, watching the other passengers board with an expression that grew increasingly sour with each passing minute. The first-class cabin had filled with passengers, most of whom were already settling into their seats and preparing for the flight, when the steady stream of economy-class passengers began flowing through the aisle. Margaret Thornton watched each person pass with the keen eye of someone cataloging inventory, and with each black face that moved past her seat, her expression grew more pinched, her posture more rigid. She took a long sip of her champagne, her diamonds catching the light as she raised the glass to her lips. When she set it down on the armrest, she caught the eye of Denise Parker, who was helping another passenger stow their luggage. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Is it always like this on your flights?" Denise approached with her professional smile firmly in place. "I'm sorry, ma'am, could you clarify what you mean?" Margaret waved her hand vaguely toward the aisle. "This. All of this. The clientele." Her emphasis on the last word dripped with implication. Denise's smile never wavered, though something flickered behind her eyes. "Atlantic Airways welcomes all passengers, ma'am. Can I get you anything else?" Margaret huffed and turned away, muttering just loudly enough for Denise to hear, "What is this airline coming to?" The first major wave of tension came when the students from Frederick Douglass High School began boarding. There were 15 of them, young black men and women between the ages of 16 and 18, all wearing matching navy blue polo shirts embroidered with their school's name and logo. They moved through the first-class cabin with the barely contained excitement of teenagers embarking on an adventure, but they were notably well-behaved, their voices kept at reasonable volumes, their movements careful not to bump into seated passengers. Leading the group was Mr. Raymond Collins, a 45-year-old history teacher who had organized this college tour trip. Behind him was Ms. Patricia Hayes, the school's college counselor, who had spent months preparing these students for the possibility of higher education that many of their families had never experienced. Both teachers kept watchful eyes on their charges, gently reminding them to move steadily and stay together. As the students filed through first class, several of them glanced at the luxury surroundings with wide eyes, imagining perhaps a future where they too might sit in such seats. Margaret Thornton watched the procession with undisguised contempt. Her fingers tightened around her champagne glass as student after student passed her row. When one young woman accidentally made eye contact with her and offered a polite smile, Margaret looked away as if she had been presented with something offensive. As the last few students moved past, Margaret pulled out her cell phone and held it to her ear. She was not actually calling anyone, but she spoke loudly enough that everyone within 3 rows could hear her clearly. "I cannot believe they're letting these people on the same plane with us," she announced to her imaginary conversation partner. "This is absolutely unacceptable. In my day, there were standards." Several of the students clearly heard her words. A young man near the back of the group, broad-shouldered and tall, stopped and turned, his face flushing with anger. "Mr. Collins quickly placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep moving, Darnell," he said quietly but firmly. "Don't give her what she wants." The student hesitated, his jaw clenched, but he allowed himself to be guided forward. Ms. Hayes, bringing up the rear, met Margaret's gaze for just a moment, her expression unreadable, before continuing down the aisle with her students. The teachers exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, the weariness of people who had dealt with such attitudes their entire lives. The Robinson family boarded about 10 minutes later, and their entrance drew even more attention from Margaret Thornton. There were 6 of them spanning 3 generations. At the front was Harold Robinson, 78 years old but standing straight and proud, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark skin. He wore a well-tailored gray suit and walked with the deliberate dignity of a man who had earned his place in the world. Beside him was his wife Bessie, 75, elegant in a lavender dress, her silver hair styled in soft waves. Behind them came their son Thomas, 52, and his wife Cynthia, 50, both dressed in business casual attire that spoke of professional success. Thomas kept a protective hand on the backs of his 8-year-old twins, Jaden and Jayla, who bounced along in matching outfits, their eyes taking in everything with the wonder that only children possess. The family had reserved seats in business class, directly behind the first-class cabin, and Harold's reservation notes indicated that he was a retired federal judge, though Margaret had no way of knowing this. As the Robinsons passed through first class, the twins spotted Margaret and, with the innocent friendliness of children, they smiled and waved at her. Margaret recoiled as if she had been threatened, turning her face toward the window and refusing to acknowledge them. Jayla's small face crumpled in confusion. "Daddy, why did that lady look at us mean?" she whispered to Thomas. Her father squeezed her hand. "Some people are having a bad day, sweetheart. It's not about you." But both he and Cynthia knew the truth, and they exchanged a look of resigned pain that parents of black children in America knew all too well. Bessie Robinson, who had marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in her youth, glanced at Margaret with an expression that mixed sadness with something harder. She had seen that look on white faces for nearly 8 decades, and she was tired, bone-tired, of pretending it did not still hurt. Harold patted his wife's arm gently, and the family continued to their seats without incident. But the atmosphere in that section of the plane had shifted, charged with an uncomfortable tension that several passengers noticed. The flight had not even left the ground, and already the shadows of America's oldest wounds were stretching across the aisles. The boarding process was nearly complete, and the cabin crew had begun their final preparations for departure. The main cabin door was still open, but ground crew members were already positioning themselves to close it. Margaret Thornton had consumed 2 glasses of champagne by this point, and the alcohol had dissolved whatever thin filter had been restraining her. She jabbed the call button repeatedly, the electronic chime sounding again and again until Kevin Sullivan, the purser, made his way to her seat. Kevin was a 45-year-old white man with a calm demeanor and 2 decades of experience handling difficult passengers. He had dealt with drunks, medical emergencies, and everything in between, but nothing in his training had quite prepared him for what was about to unfold. "Yes, ma'am, how can I assist you?" he asked, leaning down to speak with her privately. Margaret's eyes darted around the cabin before she grabbed Kevin's arm and pulled him closer. "We need to speak privately," she hissed. "This is urgent." Kevin allowed himself to be led to a small alcove near the front galley, where Margaret positioned herself with her back to the other passengers. "There's a serious problem with this flight," Margaret began, her voice a sharp whisper that somehow still carried more than she realized. "Look around you. Count them." Kevin's brow furrowed in confusion. "Count what, ma'am?" Margaret's face twisted with impatience. "The black people. There are too many black people on this flight. Far too many. I demand to be moved to a different aircraft, or better yet, have some of them removed. Surely you have regulations about this sort of thing." Kevin felt his stomach drop. In 20 years of flying, he had never had a passenger make such a request so baldly. He took a breath, keeping his professional composure through sheer force of will. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not possible. We don't discriminate based on race. All of these passengers have purchased tickets and have every right to be on this flight." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I am Margaret Thornton. My late husband built half of the shopping centers in Georgia. I donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to this airline every year. I have friends on your board of directors. Now, I suggest you reconsider your position before I have your job." Kevin stood his ground, though he could feel sweat forming at his collar. "Ma'am, regardless of your donations or connections, what you're asking is not only against company policy but against federal law. I cannot remove passengers because of their race. I won't." Margaret's face turned a shade of red that clashed violently with her carefully applied makeup. She pushed past Kevin and strode to the center of the first-class cabin, her heels clicking against the floor with each angry step. Several passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, sensing that something was wrong. Margaret did not disappoint them. "Listen to me, all of you," she announced, her voice rising to a volume that carried well beyond first class. "I refuse to fly with all these black people. This is absolutely unacceptable." She swept her arm in a gesture that encompassed the entire aircraft. "I paid premium money for a premium experience, not to be surrounded by these people." The cabin fell silent. Passengers throughout the plane craned their necks to see what was happening. Cell phones began to rise, their cameras pointed at the spectacle unfolding in first class. The businessman across the aisle from Margaret's seat, a black man in his 40s, closed his laptop with deliberate calm, his face carefully blank. The older black woman with the novel lowered her book, her expression one of weary recognition. Denise Parker stepped forward, her training kicking in even as her heart pounded with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "You're disturbing other passengers." Margaret wheeled on her, pointing a diamond-studded finger directly at Denise's face. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she shrieked. "You're part of the problem. How did someone like you even get this job? Did they have to fill some quota? Is that why this airline has gone downhill?" Denise felt the words like physical blows, but she did not step back. She had faced passengers like this before, though rarely so openly vicious. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to please take your seat." Margaret let out a laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Or what? You'll have me arrested? For speaking the truth? For demanding basic standards?" She turned back to her audience, many of whom were now openly recording her. "Can you believe this? They're going to let this woman threaten me? A paying customer? While they let criminals and welfare cases fly in the same plane as decent people?" The passengers' reactions varied across a wide spectrum. Some white passengers looked down at their laps, their cheeks burning with secondhand shame. Others watched with open mouths, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A businessman named Bradley Foster, seated in 1C, could not remain silent any longer. He was a white man in his 50s, a corporate attorney from Buckhead who had never considered himself particularly political. But this was too much. "Ma'am, please sit down," he said, standing up from his seat. "You're embarrassing yourself and making everyone uncomfortable." Margaret rounded on him with venom in her eyes. "Stay out of this, race traitor," she spat. "Have some dignity. Have some pride in your own kind." Bradley's face went pale, and he slowly sat back down, clearly shaken by being attacked for simply speaking up. In the main cabin, the students from Frederick Douglass High School had heard everything. Several of them had tears streaming down their faces, while others sat rigid with anger. Mr. Collins had moved to the aisle, positioning himself as a buffer between his students and the ugliness pouring from first class. Ms. Hayes was moving between the students, whispering words of comfort and reassurance. "Stay calm," she told them. "This is not about us. This is about her. Remember who you are." But the pain in her own eyes belied her steady words. Margaret Thornton had passed the point of no return, and everyone on that aircraft knew it. Whatever thin veneer of civilization she had maintained was now completely gone, replaced by a raw ugliness that shocked even those who thought they had seen everything. She stood in the aisle between first class and business class, blocking the path, her chest heaving with self-righteous fury. "This plane will not take off," she announced, her voice ringing through the cabin. "Do you hear me? I will not allow it. Not until every single black person is removed from this aircraft." She pointed toward the back of the plane, where the students from Frederick Douglass High School sat in stunned silence. "Especially those little gang members back there. Look at them with their matching shirts like some kind of uniform. They're probably carrying drugs. Have any of you searched their bags? Have you?" Her accusations hung in the air like poison, each word designed to wound. Ms. Patricia Hayes, who had spent 18 years as a college counselor helping young people like these students achieve their dreams, could not stay silent any longer. She stood up from her seat, her entire body trembling with controlled rage. "How dare you," she called out, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "How dare you speak about these children that way? These are honor students. They have scholarships waiting for them. They have worked harder than you could possibly imagine to be here, and you have no right whatsoever, to speak about them like that." Margaret laughed dismissively. "Oh, please. Honor students? Is that what they're calling it now? I know exactly what kind of kids come from schools like that. My husband did business in those neighborhoods. He knew what those people are really like." The word "those" dripped from her lips like acid, and Ms. Hayes felt her fists clench at her sides. "Mr. Collins was suddenly beside her, his hand on her arm. "Patricia," he said quietly, "don't. That's exactly what she wants." Ms. Hayes took a shaking breath and sat back down, but her eyes never left Margaret's face. Then Margaret did something that made everyone's blood run cold. She began walking toward the emergency exit door, her manicured fingers reaching for the handle. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin. A woman somewhere in the back screamed. Kevin Sullivan lunged forward but stopped short when Margaret wrapped her hand around the lever. "Don't come any closer," she warned, her eyes wild. "I know how these things work. My husband had his own private jet. If you don't start removing people right now, I will open this door. See if I don't." The panic was instantaneous. Parents clutched their children. Passengers gripped their armrests with white knuckles. An elderly man began praying in Spanish. Kevin held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Ma'am, please, let's talk about this. You don't want to do that. If you open that door, people could get seriously hurt." Margaret's smile was terrifying in its certainty. "Then you'd better start listening to my demands. Let me pause here and ask you something. What would you do if you were on this flight right now? Would you stand up and say something, or would you stay silent to avoid becoming a target?" If you think Margaret deserved to face consequences for her actions, Comment number 1 right now. If you think the other passengers should have physically stopped her earlier, comment number 2. And if you're as outraged by this behavior as I am, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you can see how this incredible story ends. The question is, with Margaret threatening to open the emergency exit, with passengers in a state of panic, and with no security on board yet, who could possibly stop her? Who had the authority, the presence, and the courage to end this nightmare? The answer was about to step through a door that no one was expecting to open. Vincent Crawford, a 38-year-old former professional basketball player who now worked as a motivational speaker, rose from his seat in business class. At 6 feet 8 inches tall and 240 pounds of muscle, he was an imposing figure. He had spent his life being perceived as a threat simply because of his size and his skin color, and he had learned to move slowly, to speak softly, to make himself smaller in a world that feared him. But he could not sit by while a madwoman threatened the safety of every person on this plane. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice carrying calm authority, "please step away from that door. No one wants anyone to get hurt." Margaret's eyes went wide with exactly the fear that Vincent had spent his whole life trying not to inspire. "See," she screamed, pointing at him. "He's going to attack me. This is exactly why I don't want them here. Someone help me. He's threatening me." Vincent immediately raised both hands above his head and took a step backward. "I'm not threatening anyone," he said clearly, for the cameras he knew were recording. "I just want everyone to be safe." But Margaret kept screaming, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch that made rational conversation impossible. And then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through butter, came a voice from the intercom system. It was deep, calm, and carried the unmistakable authority of command. "This is your captain speaking. Everyone please remain calm. I am coming out to address the situation." The cabin fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned toward the cockpit door at the front of the plane. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the reinforced door swung open. The figure that emerged seemed to fill the entire doorway. Captain Jerome Washington stepped into the cabin, his uniform impeccable, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. The light from the cockpit created a halo effect behind him as he moved forward with measured steps. Each footfall seemed to echo in the silence. He walked past the first row of seats, past the second, his eyes fixed on Margaret Thornton, who still had her hand on the emergency exit lever. But something had changed in her face. The manic certainty was flickering, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. Because the man walking toward her, the man with the 4 gold stripes of a captain on his shoulders, the man who held absolute authority over this aircraft and everyone on it, was black. Captain Jerome Washington continued his measured walk toward Margaret Thornton, and with each step he took, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been frozen in fear began to breathe again. Those who had been recording on their phones adjusted their angles to capture every moment of what was about to unfold. Jerome's face remained completely neutral, revealing nothing of whatever he might be feeling inside. He had spent decades mastering the art of composure under pressure, from the cockpit of an F-16 over hostile territory to the boardrooms where airline executives questioned whether a black man could truly command a commercial aircraft. This situation, as unprecedented as it was, required the same steady hand. He stopped approximately 3 feet from Margaret, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to give her no excuse to claim he had invaded her space. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, taking in the expensive clothes, the glittering jewelry, the face that was now cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and the beginnings of something that might have been fear. "Ma'am," Jerome said, and his voice was like velvet over steel, "I'm Captain Jerome Washington. I'm the commander of this aircraft. I understand there's a situation that needs to be addressed." Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times before words finally emerged. You're the pilot." Her voice had lost much of its earlier power, replaced by something that sounded almost childlike in its disbelief. "Wait, you're the captain of this plane?" Jerome inclined his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I have been flying for over 35 years, including 20 years in the United States Air Force. I am fully certified and qualified to command this Boeing 777. Is there something about my credentials you'd like to verify? The question was asked mildly, but its implications were razor-sharp. Margaret seemed to shrink slightly, but she was not ready to surrender. She released the emergency exit handle and turned to face Jerome fully, attempting to reclaim some of her earlier authority. Well, then you should understand, she said, her voice finding some of its imperious tone again. As a professional, you must see that having so many of your kind, on this flight is making other passengers uncomfortable. Surely you can do something about it. Reassign some people to other flights. Whatever it takes. The irony of the situation seemed lost on her entirely. She was asking a black man to remove black passengers because their presence offended her. Jerome let the silence stretch for just a moment, allowing the absurdity of her request to settle over the listening passengers. Then he spoke again, his voice remaining perfectly calm. Ma'am, could you point out to me which passengers are uncomfortable? I'd like to speak with them directly and address their concerns. Margaret blinked, thrown off balance by the request. She turned to look at the passengers around her, searching for allies, for anyone who would stand with her. But every face she encountered offered nothing but cold stares, averted eyes, or outright hostility. Bradley Foster, whom she had called a race traitor, met her gaze without flinching. The elderly white couple in row 3 shook their heads in silent condemnation. Even the flight attendants, including Kevin Sullivan, watched her with expressions that held no sympathy. Well, Margaret stammered, I'm uncomfortable. That should be enough. I'm a premium customer. I demand to be treated with respect. Jerome nodded slowly, as if carefully considering her words. I see, he said. So, if I understand correctly, you are the only passenger who has expressed discomfort with the racial composition of this flight. Is that accurate? Margaret's face flushed deep red. That doesn't matter. I have rights. I'm an American citizen, and I have the right to fly without being subjected to. She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence without explicitly stating what everyone already knew. Jerome stepped slightly closer, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet power of absolute authority. Ma'am, let me explain something to you about rights and about how things work on an aircraft. When you stepped onto this plane, you entered my jurisdiction. Federal aviation regulations grant the captain of an aircraft absolute authority over all matters of safety and order while on board. That authority supersedes your money, your connections, and your personal preferences. He paused, letting his words sink in. Furthermore, the contract of carriage that you agreed to when you purchased your ticket clearly states that any passenger who engages in disruptive behavior may be denied transportation and removed from the aircraft. Margaret's eyes widened. Are you threatening me? She demanded, though her voice had lost its conviction. Do you have any idea how much money I have? How many lawyers I can afford? Jerome's expression did not change by even a fraction. Ma'am, on this aircraft, money does not determine who stays and who goes. Behavior does. And your behavior today has been disruptive, discriminatory, and dangerous. You threatened to open an emergency exit. You have verbally attacked passengers and crew members. You have created a hostile environment that has traumatized children and caused distress to hundreds of people. From somewhere in the cabin, someone began to clap. The applause spread like a wave, growing louder as passenger after passenger joined in, showing their support for the captain who was finally putting into words what they had all been feeling. The applause died down gradually, leaving behind a charged silence that seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Margaret Thornton stood in the aisle, her earlier aggression now replaced by something that looked almost like bewilderment. She had expected confrontation, perhaps even removal from the plane, but she had not expected to be so thoroughly outmatched, and certainly not by a black man in a pilot's uniform. Before she could formulate a response, another voice rang out from the business class cabin. Wait a moment. I know this man. Everyone turned to see an elderly white gentleman rising from his seat, using the headrest to steady himself. He was in his early 80s, with a full head of white hair and the bearing of someone who had once been quite formidable. His eyes, bright blue and sharp despite his age, were fixed on Captain Washington with an expression of wonder. "My name is George Mitchell," the old man announced, his voice carrying the slight quaver of age but losing none of its clarity. "Retired Colonel, United States Army. And if I'm not mistaken, that man right there is the Jerome Washington. The one they called Iceman." Jerome's professional mask flickered for just a moment, replaced by surprise and what might have been a hint of a smile. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, inclining his head in recognition. "It's been a long time, sir." George Mitchell began making his way toward the front of the cabin, passengers pressing back to give him room. "You bet it has, son. Too long." He turned to address the other passengers, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "Let me tell you all something about this man. During Operation Desert Storm, my son was a young pilot, fresh out of training, flying his first real combat mission. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire over enemy territory. He went down about 50 miles behind enemy lines. The cabin had gone completely silent again, every ear straining to catch every word. The rescue mission was what we call extremely high risk. The brass was ready to write my boy off, say it was too dangerous to send anyone in after him. But this man," he pointed at Jerome, "he volunteered. He flew his fighter jet into that hellfire and provided cover for the rescue helicopter. Took damage to his own aircraft. Nearly got himself killed. But he didn't leave until my son was safely in that chopper and on his way home." George Mitchell's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "My son is alive today because of Captain Washington. He's got 3 kids now, my grandchildren, and they exist because a black man from Chicago cared more about saving a life than about the color of the man he was saving." He turned to face Margaret directly. "This man is a war hero. He has medals that most people only dream about. He has served this country with more honor and distinction than you could ever comprehend. And you have the audacity to suggest that people who look like him don't belong?" The silence that followed was devastating. Margaret seemed to physically shrink under the weight of the revelation. But George Mitchell was not the only one with something to say. Harold Robinson, the patriarch of the 3-generation family, rose from his seat in business class. At 78, he moved with the deliberate care of age, but his presence commanded immediate respect. "I feel I should introduce myself as well," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "My name is Harold Robinson. For 30 years, I served as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. I was nominated by President Reagan and confirmed by the Senate." He stepped into the aisle, straightening his jacket. "This woman," he gestured toward Margaret without looking at her, "called my grandchildren thugs and criminals. My grandson, Jaden, is 8 years old. He reads at a college level. He wants to be an astronaut. My granddaughter, Jayla, has been playing violin since she was 4. She performed at Carnegie Hall last year as part of a youth orchestra. They are in the gifted program at their school. Their father," he nodded toward Thomas, "is a neurosurgeon. Their mother is a professor of economics at Emory University. Thugs and criminals." He shook his head slowly. "Madam, you know nothing. Nothing at all." Bessie Robinson stood beside her husband, her small frame somehow filling the space with quiet power. "I marched with Dr. King," she said simply. "In Birmingham. In Selma. I was there when they turned the dogs on us. When they turned the hoses on children younger than my great-grandchildren. I have seen hatred up close. I have felt its teeth." Her voice never rose above a conversational tone, but every word carried the weight of history. "And after all these years, after all the progress we've made, after all the blood and tears and sacrifice, there are still people like you. Refusing to see our humanity. Refusing to accept that we belong. After 60 years, some things never change. And that is the greatest tragedy of all. From the back of the plane, Raymond Collins stood up. His voice carried clearly through the cabin. Those gang members you mentioned, ma'am. Those students in the matching shirts. Let me tell you about them. Among those 15 young people, we have 5 with perfect SAT scores. 3 have already received early acceptance to Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. 2 are national merit scholars. 1 invented a water filtration device that's being used in developing countries. And that young man right there, he pointed to a tall, quiet student named Calvin, is the grandson of a Tuskegee airman. The cabin seemed to gasp collectively. Calvin stood up slowly, his eyes red but his jaw set with determination. My grandfather, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it, flew 130 missions in World War II. He was one of the first black military pilots in American history. He fought for a country that wouldn't even let him eat at the same lunch counter as white soldiers. But he served anyway. He told me once, they can hate us, but they can never break us. He looked directly at Margaret, and in his young face was the strength of generations. You can't break us either, ma'am. No matter how hard you try. The revelations had stripped away any remaining pretense of Margaret Thornton's moral high ground. She stood in the aisle like a woman watching her world crumble, which in many ways she was. The passengers who had seemed like faceless targets for her hatred had transformed into war heroes, federal judges, civil rights icons, and exceptional young people whose accomplishments far exceeded anything she had ever achieved beyond marrying wealthy. But her downfall was only beginning. A young woman in her mid-20s, Amanda Stevens, stood up from her seat in the middle cabin. She was of Asian descent, with purple-streaked hair and a laptop bag covered in social justice stickers. She held up her smartphone, the screen facing outward. Mrs. Thornton, she said, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice, I've been live-streaming this entire incident since the moment you stood up and started shouting. As of right now, you have over 50,000 people watching. Margaret's face went pale. What? No. You can't do that. That's illegal. I'll sue you. Amanda shook her head. Actually, there's no expectation of privacy in a public space like an aircraft cabin. But that's not even the interesting part. She glanced at her phone screen. The really interesting part is that my viewers have been doing some research. They've already identified you from your jewelry and that very distinctive Chanel suit. They've found your social media profiles, which were public until about 2 minutes ago. Someone on your end must be trying to do damage control. They've identified the charity organizations you're associated with. They've found news articles about your husband's business dealings. And they've started contacting every single one of those organizations to share this video. Margaret's phone, tucked in her designer handbag, began to buzz. Then it buzzed again. And again. Within seconds, it was vibrating almost continuously, a swarm of notifications that could not be ignored. With shaking hands, she reached for it, her face a mask of dawning horror as she scrolled through the messages. Her lips moved silently as she read, and with each passing second, she seemed to age years. No, she whispered. No, no, no. She looked up at Amanda, then at Jerome, her eyes wild with desperation. Please, you have to make them stop. I'll pay anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Just make them delete the video. But it was far too late for that. Amanda read aloud from the comments section. The Children's Hospital Foundation has just posted that they're reviewing her membership. The Junior League of Atlanta says they're launching an immediate investigation. Oh, and someone found public records showing that her late husband's company was fined multiple times for housing discrimination. This just keeps getting better and better. Margaret's composure shattered completely. Tears began streaming down her face, cutting tracks through her expensive makeup. But these were not tears of remorse or genuine regret. They were the tears of someone watching their carefully constructed life fall apart. You don't understand, she wailed. I'm not racist. I have black friends. I donate to charities. I'm a good person. The absurdity of her protest, given everything she had said and done in the past 30 minutes, seemed to hang in the air like a bad joke. Captain Washington's voice cut through her hysteria with surgical precision. "Ma'am, your actions today speak louder than any donation you have ever made. You have terrorized children. You have insulted a federal judge and a civil rights pioneer. You have threatened the safety of everyone on this aircraft. You have shown the world exactly who you are, and no amount of money can erase that." Margaret fell back into the nearest empty seat, her head in her hands, sobbing without dignity or restraint. Jerome turned to Kevin Sullivan, the purser, who had been watching the entire scene with an expression somewhere between vindication and pity. "Please contact ground security," Jerome said, his voice returning to its professional tone. "This passenger will not be continuing on this flight. She is to be removed from the aircraft and turned over to appropriate authorities." Kevin nodded, already reaching for the intercom. "Right away, Captain." Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the cabin door. They were both African American, a irony that was lost on no one. Margaret looked up as they approached, her face a ruin of smeared makeup and shattered arrogance. "Ma'am," the senior officer said, his voice professionally neutral, "you need to come with us. You're being removed from this flight for disruptive behavior and threats against passenger safety." Margaret tried one last time. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "My lawyers will have your badges. I'll own this airline by the time I'm done." The officer's expression did not change. "Ma'am, I don't care who you are. What I care about is that you threatened to open an emergency exit at 35,000 feet, which is a federal crime. Now, you can walk out of here with whatever dignity you have left, or we can add resisting an officer to your list of problems. Your choice." Margaret chose to walk. As the security officers escorted her through the first-class cabin and toward the exit, she passed the rows of passengers who had witnessed her downfall. No one said a word. No one needed to. The silence was more powerful than any verbal condemnation could have been. Some passengers looked at her with pity, others with contempt, and many simply looked away, as if she were already invisible. As she passed the Frederick Douglass High School students, young Calvin, the grandson of the Tuskegee Airmen, caught her eye. He did not say anything cruel. He did not need to. He simply nodded once, with the quiet dignity that his grandfather had taught him, and then turned away. It was, somehow, the most devastating response of all. The cabin door closed behind Margaret Thornton with a soft click of finality. Captain Jerome Washington watched her go with an expression that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. Then he turned to face the passengers who remained, the passengers who would complete this journey under his command, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a hint of warmth touched his features. The departure of Margaret Thornton left a strange vacuum in the cabin, as if the removal of so much negative energy had created a space that needed to be filled with something better. Captain Jerome Washington seemed to sense this, because he did not immediately return to the cockpit. Instead, he walked slowly to the center of the first-class cabin and turned to face the passengers who had just witnessed one of the most dramatic confrontations any of them had ever experienced. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its edge of command and taken on a warmer, more personal quality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to take a moment to address what just happened, not as your captain, but as a man, as a black man in America, as someone who has experienced what many of you have experienced." He paused, and in that pause, the weight of generations seemed to settle on his shoulders. "I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce and expectations for young black men were tragically low. I was told, more times than I can count, that I would never amount to anything. That people who looked like me couldn't be pilots, couldn't be leaders, couldn't achieve the dreams that were supposedly reserved for others." He began walking slowly down the aisle, making eye contact with passengers as he passed. "But I refused to accept those limitations. I worked harder than anyone around me. I studied when others slept. I pushed myself beyond what I thought were my limits. And when I finally sat in the cockpit of a fighter jet for the first time, with the entire sky spread out before me, I knew that every struggle had been worth it." He stopped near the section where the Frederick Douglass students were seated, their faces turned up toward him with something approaching reverence. What happened today was ugly, Jerome continued. It was a reminder that hatred and ignorance still exist, that there are still people who see the color of our skin before they see our humanity. But I want you to understand something. That woman did not win today. Her hatred did not win. Her ignorance did not win. We won. We won because we did not lower ourselves to her level. We won because we stood together. And we won because we refused to let her define who we are. He turned specifically to address the students. You young people, you are the future. You carry the hopes of everyone who came before you, every ancestor who fought and struggled and sometimes died so that you could have the opportunities you have today. When someone like that woman tries to tell you that you don't belong, that you're somehow less than, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that a black man is commanding this aircraft. Remember that a black judge dispensed justice in the highest courts of this land. Remember that black pilots flew combat missions in World War II when they weren't even allowed to sit at the same table as white soldiers. Remember that black women and men marched and bled for the rights you now enjoy. You come from a legacy of resilience and excellence. Never forget that. Several of the students were crying openly now, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of pride, of recognition, of connection to something larger than themselves. Mr. Collins had his arm around a young woman who was sobbing into his shoulder. Ms. Hayes was nodding along with Jerome's words, her own eyes glistening. The connections that formed in the wake of Jerome's speech felt almost magical in their spontaneity. George Mitchell, the retired Army colonel, made his way to Jerome and embraced him warmly. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Then and now. Jerome returned the embrace with genuine feeling. Your son became a good man, Colonel. I've followed his career. You should be proud. Judge Harold Robinson approached next, with his entire family in tow. He shook Jerome's hand with the grip of a man who had spent decades commanding courtrooms. Captain, I would be honored if you would attend my granddaughter's wedding. It's next Saturday in Los Angeles. You would be a welcome guest. Jerome smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his stern features. I would be honored, Your Honor. Little Jaden and Jayla pushed forward, eyes wide with admiration. Captain, can we have your autograph? Jaden asked breathlessly. Jerome knelt down to their level, taking the paper and pen that Thomas Robinson hastily produced. I'll do you one better, he said, writing not just his signature but also his personal email address. When you grow up and become an astronaut and a famous violinist, I want you to send me a message and tell me all about it. Deal? Both children nodded vigorously, clutching their signed papers like precious treasures. The exchanges continued throughout the cabin as Jerome made his way back toward the cockpit. He stopped to speak with the businessman who had been called a race traitor, thanking him for speaking up. He shook hands with Vincent Crawford, the former basketball player, recognizing a kindred spirit in another black man who had learned to navigate a world that often feared him. He exchanged information with Mr. Collins, promising to visit Frederick Douglass High School to speak to students about careers in aviation. And when he reached Calvin, the grandson of the Tuskegee Airmen, he spent several minutes in quiet conversation that no one else could hear but that left the young man standing straighter than he had all day. Finally, Jerome returned to the front of the cabin and addressed the passengers one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay in our departure. We are now ready to begin our journey to Los Angeles. Our flight time will be approximately 4 hours and 30 minutes. Sit back, relax, and know that you are in good hands. A wave of applause swept through the cabin as Jerome disappeared back into the cockpit. The engines began to hum with increased power, and the massive aircraft began to move. As Flight 847 taxied toward the runway, the passengers settled into their seats with a sense of shared experience that bound them together. Strangers began talking to each other, sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Business cards were exchanged. Phone numbers were given. What had started as the worst flight experience any of them had ever had was transforming into something unexpected and beautiful. 4.5 hours later, Atlantic Airways Flight 847 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport with the kind of smooth landing that only comes from decades of experience. The passengers, many of whom had spent the flight in animated conversation with newfound friends, began gathering their belongings with a palpable sense of reluctance. No one seemed to want this experience to end. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Captain Jerome Washington's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles, where the local time is 7:45 in the evening. I want to thank you for flying with us today. This has been an unusual flight, to say the least, but I believe we've all come out of it stronger and more connected than we were before. Safe travels, everyone." The cabin door opened, and passengers began filing out, many of them pausing at the cockpit door to shake Jerome's hand or offer words of appreciation. But as the Robinson family reached the jet bridge, Jaden suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Daddy, look! There are lots of people with cameras." Indeed, the gate area was crowded with what appeared to be journalists, photographers, and camera crews. For a moment, Thomas Robinson thought they must be waiting for some celebrity on the flight. Then he heard someone shout, "That's them. The family from the video." The word had spread with the speed that only the internet could achieve. Amanda Stevens's live stream had gone viral in a way that none of them could have anticipated. Millions of people had watched Margaret Thornton's racist tirade and subsequent humiliation. News networks had picked up the story. Hashtags had been created. And somehow, in the 4.5 hours they had been in the air, Captain Jerome Washington had become a national hero. The passengers emerged from the jet bridge into a scene of controlled chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But the real surprise came when the crowd parted to reveal a small delegation of officials near the front. Among them were the governor of California, a tall woman with silver hair and a commanding presence, and beside her, wearing a dark suit with an American flag pin on his lapel, stood the Secretary of Transportation of the United States. "Captain Washington," the secretary called out, stepping forward as Jerome emerged from the jet bridge. "I'm Secretary Morrison. We've been trying to reach you for the past hour, but apparently, there's no cell service at 35,000 feet. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "On behalf of the President and the American people, I want to personally commend you for your actions today." Jerome shook the offered hand, clearly surprised by the reception. "Mr. Secretary, I was just doing my job." Governor Anderson stepped forward. "Captain, we watched that live stream along with millions of other Americans. What you did went far beyond just doing your job. You showed grace under pressure. You demonstrated leadership in the face of hatred. You inspired not just the passengers on that plane, but everyone who watched that video." She gestured to an aide, who stepped forward carrying what appeared to be an official document. "It is my honor to inform you that you have been selected to receive the California Medal of Valor, our state's highest civilian honor. Additionally, and the Secretary will speak to this, there is a federal recognition in the works as well." Secretary Morrison nodded enthusiastically. "Captain Washington, the Department of Transportation is creating a new position, National Advisor for Diversity and Inclusion in Aviation. We want to make the skies welcoming for everyone, and we can't think of anyone better suited to help us achieve that goal than you. Would you consider accepting this position?" Jerome stood silently for a moment, processing the sudden turn his day had taken. He had woken up that morning expecting nothing more than a routine flight to Los Angeles. Now he was being offered a role that could help shape the future of his entire industry. Before he could respond, a smaller commotion drew everyone's attention. Calvin, the young man who had spoken so movingly about his Tuskegee Airman grandfather, was pushing through the crowd. In his hand, he clutched an old, worn photograph. "Captain Washington," he said breathlessly, "I want you to have this." He thrust the photograph toward Jerome. Jerome took the picture carefully, as if it were made of gold. It showed a young black man in a World War II flight suit, standing beside a P-51 Mustang with a proud smile on his face. On the back, faded handwriting read, Lieutenant Charles Thomas Williams, 332nd Fighter Group, 1944. Flying free. Jerome looked at the photograph for a long moment, then at Calvin. This belonged to your grandfather? Calvin nodded. He gave it to me before he died. He said, give this to someone who keeps the dream alive. I think that's you, sir. Jerome's composure, which had held firm through everything, finally cracked. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he placed his hand on Calvin's shoulder. Your grandfather would be so proud of you. I know I am. And I promise you, I will keep this dream alive. We all will. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, a black commercial airline captain, a teenage descendant of a Tuskegee airman, and a photograph that bridged generations of struggle and triumph. Around them, the other passengers from Flight 847 had gathered, creating a semicircle of support and solidarity. Harold and Bessie Robinson stood with their family, the twins waving at the cameras with childish delight. The students from Frederick Douglass High School clustered together, their teachers beaming with pride. George Mitchell, the retired colonel whose son Jerome had saved in Desert Storm, wiped his eyes unashamedly. Even passengers who had simply been strangers caught up in an extraordinary situation lingered to witness the conclusion of this remarkable day. As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow over the city of angels, Captain Jerome Washington turned to face the gathered crowd and cameras. I didn't do anything extraordinary today, he said, his voice clear and strong. I just did what was right. What everyone should do. When you see injustice, don't look away. Stand up. Speak out. Because silence is complicity. We all have a role to play in building a better world, whether we're commanding an aircraft, teaching in a classroom, judging in a courtroom, or simply living our lives with dignity and purpose. Every one of us has the power to make a difference. Use it. The applause that followed seemed to echo beyond the airport terminal, carried by the countless viewers still watching through their screens around the world. And as for Margaret Thornton, the news was already reporting the fallout. She had been permanently banned from flying on any major U.S. airline. Every social club and charity organization she had been associated with had cut ties with her. An investigation had been launched into her late husband's business practices, revealing years of discriminatory housing policies. Her name had become synonymous with entitled racism, a cautionary tale shared across social media with warnings of what happened when hatred met justice. But perhaps the most fitting epilogue came 6 months later, when the very first recipient of the new Jerome Washington Scholarship for Young Aviators was announced. A young man named Calvin Williams, grandson of a Tuskegee airman, would be attending the United States Air Force Academy with a full scholarship. He would follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, of Jerome Washington, of all the black aviators who had looked up at the sky and refused to be told they didn't belong there. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Was it Jerome's calm authority in the face of hatred? The wisdom of Judge Robinson and his wife Bessie? The courage of young Calvin and his fellow students? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I would love to know what this story meant to you. If this video inspired you, if it reminded you that standing up for what's right is always worth it, please hit that like button. It helps more people see stories like this one. And if you're not already subscribed, what are you waiting for? Click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Share it with your family, your friends, your community. Because stories like this one, stories of courage and dignity and justice, deserve to be shared far and wide. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, whether you're flying at 35,000 feet or walking on solid ground, you have the power to stand up for what's right. You have the power to be someone's Captain Washington. Use that power. The world is counting on you. Until next time, fly high and keep believing in the good. I wish you all peace, love, and the courage to speak truth in the face of hatred. See you in the next story. This story teaches us that true power has nothing to do with money, social status, or the color of your skin. Margaret Thornton believed her wealth gave her the right to demean others, but she discovered that hatred ultimately destroys the one who carries it. Captain Jerome Washington showed us that dignity and composure are the most powerful weapons against ignorance. He did not respond to hatred with hatred. Instead, he used his authority, earned through decades of service and sacrifice, to stand firm for what was right. We also learn that silence in the face of injustice makes us accomplices. The passengers who spoke up, from Colonel Mitchell to Judge Robinson to young Calvin, demonstrated that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to stay silent. Every voice matters. Every act of courage inspires another. Perhaps the most important lesson is that excellence is the best response to discrimination. Jerome Washington did not become a decorated war hero and respected airline captain by complaining about barriers. He broke through them by being undeniably excellent at what he did. The students from Frederick Douglass High School represent this same truth. They answered hatred with achievements, bigotry with brilliance. Finally, this story reminds us that we are all connected. The bonds formed on that flight, between strangers of different races, ages, and backgrounds, prove that our common humanity is stronger than any force that tries to divide us. Now I want to ask you something important. If you were on that plane, would you have had the courage to speak up like Colonel Mitchell or Judge Robinson? What would you have said to Margaret Thornton? Share your thoughts in the comments below because I truly want to know how this story affected you. If Captain Washington's calm strength in the face of hatred inspired you, smash that like button right now. Your like helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. If you believe that stories of justice and dignity deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And please, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that standing up for what is right always matters. Send it to your friends, your family, your coworkers. Let this story spread across the world. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this community. Your support means everything. I wish you courage in every situation where you must choose between silence and speaking truth. May you always find the strength to be someone's Captain Washington. Fly high, stand tall, and never let anyone tell you where you belong. See you in the next story. Peace and blessings to you all.